this might sound a little flippant given the gravity of the situation, but imagine if you were charged with concocting a story or an event that was designed to discover whether or not there was any point at which somebody would detach themselves from a fascist project, from a fascist administration. I mean, if you actually had to come up with the details. Tragically, the murder of Renee Good was not enough, because I think it was, and remember, we're trying to get into the minds of people who have been sympathetic so far to the fascism. And Renee Good was married to a woman. I think she had dyed hair. She described herself as a poet. Forgive me for putting it like that. She was a poet. But the fact that she described herself as a poet allowed people to snigger and sneer. And so when she was murdered by a member of ICE, it kind of lent itself to both sidesism in a way that was as tragic as it was predictable. You couldn't watch that footage, of course, and conclude that any threat, any peril whatsoever was motivating the behaviour of the man who murdered her. But you could watch that footage and find just enough to cling on to publicly pretend that you believed that. So you'll remember, we sat here and we said, Orwell, the party told you to ignore the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most terrible command. And we watched it happen in real time. We watched and listened to people pretending that they could not see what we could see, that they could not see what they could see, and that they could somehow cobble together a case for self-defense or provocation or whatever it may be. And there was just enough for the people thus far sympathetic to or warm towards the fascism, the racism, the misogyny, the climate change denial, whichever it was, whatever part of that holy trinity it was that most appealed to somebody who wouldn't come out and describe horrors as horrors. There was just enough for them to pretend, wasn't there? Just enough for them to sort of set. And I'm talking about people right up to the top of up to and including the President of the United States of America. And you need to bear that in mind, because the questions that we're going to ask this morning are not as easy to answer as you might originally think, for the very simple reason that this goes all the way to the very top of the White House. And then you come to the events of this weekend. You come to the murder in cold blood and broad daylight of a man who was doing absolutely nothing wrong, except trying to protect a woman who was being brutalised by ICE agents. And what I meant earlier when I suggested that you could concoct a story designed to find out whether or not people really would put up with anything, whether people really would look the other way when the worst and most undeniable atrocities were unfolding under their noses, you'd struggle to do better than the case of Alex Pretti, 37-year-old, and an intensive care unit nurse. I know this shouldn't matter, but it does. That's the nature of the species. That's what we do. An intensive care unit nurse who worked specifically and exclusively with military veterans. There are hospitals in the United States of America that are dedicated to veterans. They're VA hospitals, Veterans Affairs, and it is a kind of way that you sidestep the fact that they haven't got an NHS, in that if you have done military service, you kind of get looked after health-wise in ways that other members of the population don't. And that was his job. That was his job. Working in a Veterans Affairs hospital's intensive care unit, providing in some cases end-of-life care to people who had been prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice in the service of the United States of America. They murdered an intensive care nurse who worked exclusively with military veterans and I think some of their dependents in broad daylight, and then they called him a terrorist. I mean, you know, how many times have I said to you in the last month, year, that we have to have a hyperbole alarm in the back of our heads, and you have this normality bias as well. It's a phrase we've used a lot. I think that the academics call it a normalcy bias. But you have this thing in your head that keeps telling you it can't be as bad as it looks because this is the West, this is the United States, this is the United Kingdom. I include the United Kingdom because so many members of our media and political class have been very warm towards. I think Farage and Badenoch even want an ICE-type project to unfold here. State-sanctioned murderers roaming the streets of Britain looking for people who are a bit too brown. Well, we know there are members of Farage's party who'd love that. She'd probably start with the ones in adverts, stick them on a list and hunt them down. But you have this hyperbole. See, that was hyperbole for now. But nothing hyperbolic about the first bit of this paragraph, the bit about the intensive care unit nurse who worked in a Veterans Affairs hospital and was murdered in broad daylight by US Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers. I don't think that anybody unsheltered or uncamouflaged by status and power can do what they did to Renee Good and pretend that there are two sides to this story. I really don't. I don't want you to watch the footage because you will never forget it. But if you have already, you will know that there are no two sides to this story, although you wouldn't know that from looking at much of the coverage, including the BBC's online coverage yesterday, which talked about conflicting accounts. Our job as journalists, if somebody says it's raining, is to stick our head out of the window and see if it gets wet. And if it doesn't, guess what? It's not raining. Conflicting accounts. So for me, one of the first things that struck me was that difference between, and it's just a consequence, I think, of this mad job that I've got. It was the consequence, I think, of this job that made me start thinking about coverage a little bit earlier than a normal person would. Maybe that's not true. Maybe you were immediately outraged by the evidence of murder, followed fast upon by the slander, the libel of terrorist, of an ICU nurse who dedicated his working life to looking after military veterans. And I don't know what happens next. I don't know. So if you think about the murder of Renee Good as a massive fracture in the infrastructure of reality, reporting reality, a massive fracture, but not a complete breach. You could still just about intellectually process the people who were pretending to believe that there was a case for her murder, a case for her killing. You could still just about, okay, well, she was in a car. And a car is a big and heavy thing. She wasn't posing any threat to anybody and she was trying to get away, but you could pretend otherwise, you could claim otherwise. That's a fracture in what I would call the framework of reporting reality. Because we had to report all the people pretending otherwise. And then you come to Alex Pretti. I'm just going to play you something before we carry on. I don't know what question exactly that I am going to ask you yet, but I want first to play you a video that was taken in December of 2024 in the hospital where he works at the Veterans Affairs facility in Richfield, Minnesota. It's only half a minute. And this is Alex Pretti, described by Donald Trump's administration as a domestic terrorist after their own Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents murdered him in cold blood in broad daylight. This is him reading a final salute for a US veteran called Terrence Lee Randolph, something which I presume he's called upon to do on a relatively regular basis. And this is what I mean when I talk about the story almost being designed to help everybody else discover who is so broken and sick and debased and bigoted that they still won't recognise, or they still won't condemn because they can't not recognise it now. They still won't condemn what they're watching.
Terrence Lee Randolph, March 30th, 1947, December 10th, 2024. Today we remember that freedom is not free. We have to work at it, nurture it, protect it, and even sacrifice for it. May we never forget and always remember our brothers and sisters who have served so that we may enjoy the gift of freedom. So in this moment, we remember and give thanks for their dedication and selfless service to our nation in the cause of our freedom. In this solemn hour, we render them our honor and our gratitude.
Alex Pretti there reading the final honours, I think is the technical term, for a veteran that he cared for as an ICU nurse. Today we remember that freedom is not free. We have to work at it, even sacrifice for it. I have a statement also from his parents that I'll share with you shortly. And this is the man that they have called a domestic terrorist. This is the man that Christine Noem lied about. Lied about in broad daylight on live television. Blatant and obvious lies. And it's almost like every question I've ever asked you about this descent into fascism is simultaneously redundant and requiring that I ask you again. You can't pretend anymore. Sometimes I think it's worthwhile having a little look at what the Daily Mail is doing, because it is so bent and so morally bankrupt and so disgusting. You just have this absolutely extraordinary inability. That's why I keep mentioning the list of things that sit alongside Donald Trump, although he now obviously deserves a category all of his own. But all the things they've been wrong about, hideously wrong, whether it's Brexit or Boris Johnson or Liz Truss or austerity, they haven't admitted that they've been wrong about any of it. And they, of course, have been massive cheerleaders for Donald Trump, up to and including their star columnist Dick Littlejohn last week, wishing out loud in print that Donald Trump was in charge here, the man whose administration murders nurses and then describes them as terrorists. Yeah, lots of that, please, warts and all. Was he a threat, or was he shot dead after his gun was taken, is the question mark. Was it Q Twain? Do you remember that little craze a few years ago on the internet? Questions to which the answer is no. QTWAIN. You don't ask questions about this. It would be a bit like asking a question about whether or not the sun came up this morning in your town, whether or not, I don't know, actually I will stick with that, whether or not the sun came up, whether or not water quenches your thirst, whether or not hot things burn. Was he a threat? And then someone called Freddie Gray, the deputy editor of The Spectator, who I don't know, and I don't want to speak ill of people I'm not overly familiar with, but if this clown hasn't used the phrase Trump derangement syndrome, then I would be very, very surprised. These brutalised killings will only serve to validate claims Trump is turning the US into a fascist state. Just think about that. It's not these brutalised killings prove that Trump is turning the US into a fascist state, which is what anybody honest and decent or hadn't spent a significant part of the last 12 months or even 10 years pretending that Trump was anything other than monstrous. You don't go for him. You don't go for Trump. You somehow turn it into a piece about those of us who have been describing Trump's fascism for, in many cases, years now, not just 1 year. But from the very start, and if not from the start, then from the January the 6th incited insurrection and the subsequent pardoning of the violent criminals who undertook it. So it's probably, I don't know, we'll find out actually, a consequence of my job. But how should this be covered? I'm not going to criticise newsreaders and news broadcasters. The newspapers are different. They put headlines on things. They're bent. They're corrupt. You don't have to be following events in courtrooms up and down the country over the last few years to get an idea of how these institutions and individuals have behaved in the past. But you don't look at them when you're looking for the truth. These are the people that told you Liz Truss was a genius, that Brexit would be brilliant, that Boris Johnson was a stand-up guy, that Nigel Farage is someone you can trust to clear up the mess he did more than almost anybody else to create. The Daily Mail was shilling for Hitler in the 1930s, and the grandfather of the current owner was corresponding with the top highest Nazi command. But what the heck do the rest of us do? What should I mean, I'm not, as you know, a big BBC basher, but what should the BBC be doing when there are no conflicting versions of events? There is the truth, and then there is what Trump's administration is saying. They are two completely contradictory phenomena. This is why I started reminding you of Renee Good, because there was just enough there to sustain the myth, you know? Alex Pretti was carrying a legally held handgun, as lots and lots of Americans do, which he hadn't drawn, which they've lied about. One of the ICE agents removed it, and after it was removed, another ICE agent shot him 5 times. So, I mean, they tried, and they have tried, but it isn't going to work because we can all see what happened. There isn't enough room for the liars to manoeuvre. They don't have a sixpence to turn on in the way that they did with Renee Good. But when you and this is why I said to you, you need to keep in the back of your mind the fact that it goes all the way up to Donald Trump, who, if you weren't following events, didn't apologise for maligning every single British member of the military who died in Afghanistan, but did sort of climb back a little bit on those disgusting comments that we spent all of Friday's show examining. And because there's no room to manoeuvre, there's no sixpence to turn on, there's no space for the lies, this is the bigger moment. Do you know how self-indulgent I am sometimes? This one really got me. It really got me, this one. Well, the more I found out about him, the more unable I was to process what I was feeling. Because I don't know what you do. I do that thing. What would you do, man? What would you do if it happened here? What would you do if Cammy Badenoch or Nigel Farage actually had their ICE agents marching through British streets murdering nurses and then lying about them and calling them terrorists? What would you actually do? Because what he did was so brave, so courageous. He wasn't there by accident. He wasn't there to observe. He was there to object. And he knew the risks he was taking. And he died protecting somebody else, protecting a woman. And they murdered him, and they lied about it, and they called him a terrorist. And because it goes all the way to the White House, the media establishment, and I use that as a descriptive term, not as a pejorative term, the media establishment has to report what they're saying. It has to report what they're saying as if it might be valid. We haven't got a system in place, and the same is true here in many ways. How do you deal with a world in which the biggest liars hold the most power? How do you actually do that? How do you deal with that? Because I don't know. I can do this because I am free in the context of the UK media to speak truth to power and to tell you the truth. If I had spent any of the last few years using the phrase Trump derangement syndrome to describe those of us who have been describing and predicting this for years now, I don't know what the hell I would do, to be honest with you. But I probably would have told you to vote for Brexit. I'd have spent years tickling Boris Johnson's toes. I'd have been joking about what a great guy Donald Trump is. And I'll have Nigel Farage on the show next week to give him a haircut. So I probably would be untouched and untroubled by what that would mean. But for the rest of us who care, what do you do when the lies are this egregious?